As the woke try to tear Christianity down, they also want to raise other minority faiths up, again for this idea of equality. So basically it's Christianity bad, all other faiths good. That's how they kind of look at the world. And to that end, they show unquestioning support and solidarity for basically anything that isn't Christianity, whether that be Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, or whatever. In recent years, many left-wing students in the United States have been keen to show solidarity with Islam in particular, so they are joining Muslims in offering public prayer and worship to Allah, and American female students have even started wearing hijabs for the same reason. It's not that they've converted to Islam or consider themselves Muslim or even have the first clue about what Islam actually is or what it teaches. They have no idea what Islam says. They know nothing about it. They've never touched a Quran in their lives. All they know is that Islam is a minority in the West, and therefore through the lens of intersectionality, minorities always get their compassion and unquestioning support. Now, I believe that's incredibly naive, especially in regard to Islam. So in this video, I want to explain what Islam actually is, where it came from, how it got started, their founder Muhammad, who he was, and I want to explain why Islam doesn't deserve our support. Indeed, I want to explain why the West has always historically shunned Islam and regarded it as quite a dangerous ideology. And to this end, I actually made a video just a few months ago charting the life of Muhammad and the beginnings of Islam. So I'm going to play that video right now. I'm going to incorporate that video into the series. And in this presentation, as you watch this, I hope that it opens your eyes to what Islam really is. Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was born in 570 AD in Mecca, which is in modern-day Saudi Arabia. Mecca at that time was a polytheistic society, and it's believed there were around 360 different gods being worshipped by the local tribes there. Idols were crafted for each one, and they were placed inside a big cube called the Kaaba, which became the center of the city's worship. These are some of the names of the pagan gods that were being worshipped in Mecca at that time, and amongst them was the god Allah. Allah was not considered the sole divinity by the Meccans. He was just one of hundreds of gods. Interestingly, he was believed to have kinship with the jinn, which is the Islamic word for demons. But at any rate, this pagan god was worshipped by Muhammad's family, and indeed his father was called Abdallah, or Abdullah, which means the slave of Allah. Now, Muhammad never knew his father because he died from illness before he was born, and his mother actually then died when he was just 6 years old, making him an orphan. Thereafter, he was sent to be raised firstly by his grandfather for 2 years, and then after he died, he then went to live with his uncle, a merchant called Abu Talib. Abu Talib was not a particularly successful merchant by most accounts, and most biographies will mention his relative poverty. However, Muhammad spent the next 17 years or so following Abu Talib as he traded around the region, learning how to buy and sell just like him. During those early years, Muhammad received no formal education. He never learned to read or write. Muhammad was illiterate. At 25, through these trading journeys with his uncle, he met a very wealthy tradeswoman called Khadija. Khadija was born into a wealthy family, but she'd taken over the family business and had been very successful at it. And so it was that Muhammad and Khadija got married. Khadija was considerably older than Muhammad. Some traditions say she was around 40 years old, but financially, this was a great deal for Muhammad. After growing up in relative poverty as an orphan with his uncle, he was now able to live in the lap of luxury, and he had great material wealth. By the time Muhammad reached the age of 40 himself, however, there's a suggestion in his behavior that he began to go through something of a midlife crisis. He had lots of wealth through his marriage to Khadija, but it seemed he began looking for more significance, and he began focusing on more transcendent issues. It's around this time he started wandering off by himself into the desert for extended periods, where he would find caves to meditate and pray in. His favorite cave was at a place called Hira, which is to the north of Mecca, around 2 hours walk away. He would spend days at a time hidden there, only coming back home when he was hungry to stock up on food. And it was during one of these trips to Hira that he had a very distressing supernatural experience with what appeared to be an angel. The Hadith, the Islamic texts that record the words and deeds of Muhammad, report what happened in that cave. Sahih Bukhari, which is considered one of the two most authoritative hadiths, along with Sahih Muslim, says, Muhammad used to go in seclusion to the cave of Hira, where he worshipped continuously for many days and nights. He used to take with him the journey food for that stay and then come back to his wife Khadija to take his food likewise again for another period to stay, till suddenly the truth descended upon him while he was in the cave of Hira. An angel came to him in it and asked him to read. The Prophet replied, I do not know how to read. The Prophet added, the angel caught me forcefully and pressed me so hard that I could not bear it any more. He then released me and again asked me to read, and I replied, I do not know how to read. The angel then attacked Muhammad 2 more times in this same way. Before in abject panic, he escaped and fled back home. It says he burst through the door, his neck muscles twitching with terror, till he entered upon Khadija and said, cover me, cover me. They covered him till his fear was over, and then he said, O Khadija, what is wrong with me? Muhammad was so shaken by this incident in the cave that he was afraid of what was happening to him. He thought he was either going insane or he was being possessed by a demonic spirit. This word inspiration literally means inspiritation. It means to be under the influence of some kind of spirit. Khadija tried to calm him down, but when Muhammad remained filled with terror, she took him to see her cousin, a man called Waraka. Waraka was an old man who had lost his eyesight, but he was also someone who had developed an interest in Christianity. And when he heard Muhammad's story, he told him not to worry, saying that he'd read of people being visited by angels in the Bible, and that's probably what this was. He said he was probably being visited by the angel Gabriel. Muhammad accepted this explanation, but he remained mentally disturbed, and he still harbored thoughts that he was either going insane or he'd been possessed by an evil spirit. In fact, from this point onwards, he became so overcome by depression that he tried to find relief by committing suicide. He said, woe is me, poet or possessed. Never shall the Quraysh say this of me. I will go to the top of the mountain and throw myself down, that I may kill myself and gain rest. Bukhari explains the Prophet became so sad, as we have heard, that he intended several times to throw himself from the tops of high mountains. This went on for some time, but on each occasion, as he was about to launch himself from the mountain, this supernatural being, who he now believed to be Gabriel, would block the way and tell him to return home. He said, I'd been thinking of hurling myself down from a mountain crag, but he appeared to me and said, Muhammad, I am Gabriel, and you are a messenger of God. It's interesting that when Muhammad came into contact with the spirit, he became suicidal, because if we contrast that with the Bible, when the Holy Spirit came upon the Christian believers at Pentecost, it paints a very different picture. The Bible says that when the Holy Spirit came upon the Christian believers, a deep sense of awe came over them all, and the apostles performed many miraculous signs and wonders, and all the believers met together in one place and shared everything they had. They sold their property and possessions and shared the money with those in need. They worshipped together at the temple each day, met in homes for the Lord's Supper, and shared their meals with great joy and generosity, all the while praising God and enjoying the goodwill of the people. And each day the Lord added to their fellowship those who were being saved. So whereas the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost was marked by things like awe, joy, generosity, sharing, and goodwill, when this Spirit came upon Muhammad in the cave at Hira, that was marked by terror, by panic attacks, by depression, and thoughts of suicide. To quote the Bible, but I'm not surprised, even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. In the passing of time, though, Muhammad settled into this idea that he must be a prophet, after all, and with his rich wife's financial backing, he began proclaiming himself to be such, to be a prophet from God, who he decided was Allah, his own family's God. However, Muhammad had very little success with his preaching. For the next 13 years, he tried to gather a following in Mecca, but he was only really successful with his friends and family members. This rejection from the wider Meccan society made Muhammad increasingly upset and frustrated, and he began to show signs of violence in his behavior. Bukhari reports, the Prophet entered Mecca, and at that time there were 360 idols around the Kaaba. He started stabbing the idols with a stick he had in his hand and reciting the truth, that is, Islam has come and falsehood has vanished. Attacking their idols didn't win the Meccans over. In fact, it just made them more upset. So Muhammad then tried yet another approach. He offered the Meccans a compromise. And the deal was this: if they would finally just agree to pay him some attention and regard him as a prophet, then he would agree to recognize some of their other pagan idols in addition to Allah, and he would incorporate these other gods into Islam. To solidify this deal, he called down new revelations from Allah, who apparently offered his approval for this deal. Muhammad says specifically of 3 other gods, Alat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. These are the exalted intermediaries whose intercession is to be hoped for. So he was allowing these other 3 gods specifically into his religion. Now, this idea really pleased the Meccans. When the pagan Quraysh heard this, they rejoiced and were happy and delighted at the way in which he spoke of their gods, and they listened to him, while the Muslims, having complete trust in their prophet in respect of the messages he brought from God, did not suspect him of error, illusion, or mistake. So the Meccans heard their gods were now allowed as part of Islam, and it says they then prostrated themselves alongside the Muslims to worship all these multiple gods all at once. It says, when Muhammad came to the prostration, having completed the surah, he prostrated himself, and the Muslims did likewise, following their prophet, trusting in the message which he had brought, and following his example. Those polytheists of the Quraysh and the others who were in the mosque likewise prostrated themselves because of the reference to their gods which they had heard. So there was a momentary time of peace between the Muslims and the Meccans. However, this peace didn't last for very long, and after listening to more of Muhammad's message, the Meccans once more rejected him. Now, Muhammad didn't take this rejection well at all, and he quickly retracted all those verses about accepting other gods. He changed his mind about those, and he said those verses hadn't actually really come from Allah at all, and he'd actually been tricked. Those messages had come from Satan instead. Indeed, those verses have become known as the Satanic verses. Now, from whichever angle one views this episode, it raises difficult questions for Muslims. Either Muhammad never received any supernatural revelations from Allah at all, and he was just making up expedient verses as he went along for influence and personal gain, or he genuinely did receive those verses from Satan and was unable to tell the difference between Satan's voice and Allah's. And at that point, you would then need to ask, well, what else is in the Quran from Satan that he couldn't differentiate? Both of these options leave Muhammad's integrity as a prophet in tatters, because just to be clear here, Muhammad openly admitted to being a mouthpiece for Satan. Around this time, in 619, when Muhammad was 49 years old, he had what's become known as his year of sorrow. This is the year when his uncle Abu Talib and his wife Khadija both died within a couple of months of each other. This coincided with increasing tensions between the Meccans and Muhammad as well. When the Meccans criticized a group of Muslims, a Muslim man called Sa'd bin Abu Waqqas had grabbed a camel bone and started beating one of them. And this is known as the first blood to be shed in Islam. So the violence was increasing, and this led the Meccans to come to Abu Talib on his deathbed and to plead with him to ask Muhammad to finally leave them alone. They were getting tired of this violence and the constant disruption that seemed to follow the Muslims wherever they went. A public official said to Abu Talib, "You know the trouble that exists between us and your nephew, so call him and let us make an agreement that he will leave us alone and we will leave him alone." Even though the Meccans held out this olive branch of peaceful coexistence, Muhammad rejected it, and instead he chose to keep escalating the violence. The deaths of his closest family members and the constant rejection of his own people seemed to stir up this depressive, nihilistic rage in Muhammad that just couldn't be reasoned with. So the situation finally became untenable. The Meccans decided that Muhammad would have to be captured and executed in a bid to end these troubles. In 622 AD then, when Muhammad was 52 years old, he was forced to flee Mecca for his life. He fled to Medina, which is a town about 450 kilometers to the north and one that had a large Jewish and Christian population at that time. Again, much like what he'd done in Mecca when he arrived, he initially tried to convert these Jews and Christians through his preaching, telling them that he was another prophet in the lineage of their Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, that Gabriel had appeared to him just as he'd appeared to their prophets, and saying that his Allah was the same God as their own. Much like events in Mecca, however, he was rejected by the Jews and Christians, and when you look at his message, it's really no surprise. Historians note that Muhammad didn't actually introduce any new moral ideas on top of what already existed in the Bible. There was no inspiration in his teaching. When you read the Gospels and you hear of Jesus' teaching, you're struck by how revolutionary his words actually were. Jesus said things that nobody'd ever heard before. He talked about loving enemies and how leaders should wash the feet of their servants, and he fundamentally changed the way that people were to relate to God thereafter. And the Bible often says that after Jesus had spoken, the crowds were filled with awe and wonder because they never heard anything like this before. However, scholars note that there isn't one single original moral idea in the Quran. Any moral idea that you can find in the Quran already existed in the Bible, and Muhammad merely borrowed it. And even then, because Muhammad was illiterate, he had quite a poor grasp of the Bible, and whenever he tried to borrow from it, he would often end up being garbled and confused and error-strewn. For example, Muhammad thought that Christians worshipped Mary as the third part of the Trinity. Muhammad thought that Mary was the sister of Aaron, even though Aaron was born about 2,000 years before Mary. Muhammad thought that Moses spoke to Samaritans, even though Samaritans didn't exist for another 725 years after Moses. He also confused the life of Saul and Gideon. And also, when you read the Quran, you get this clear sense that it's illiterate people trying to copy the Bible's eloquence, but not quite achieving it. They're trying to mimic the Bible's writing style because that sounds holy, but they're not quite able to do it. So the text comes across as quite nonsensical at times. Basically, Muhammad himself came across as incompetent in his preaching, and Jews and Christians saw these errors and rejected him. Indeed, the only original idea that Muhammad really brought to the world was that Muhammad was Allah's prophet and that everyone should do exactly what he says. The idea is repeated 20 times in the Quran, and it's also in the Shahada, the Islamic statement of faith, which says there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. That's the only new message that Muhammad brought to the world. So when the Jews and Christians heard this garbled, confused, error-strewn message, they dismissed him as a prophet, and this pretty much ended Muhammad's attempts to convince people through his words, through his preaching, through his teaching alone. From this point onwards, Muhammad really simply became nothing more than a warlord. Rejected by all, he turned to violence, and he was driven by revenge against those who had rejected him, namely the Meccans, the Jews, and the Christians. He gathered a group of people and he decided they would start waging Jihad, a holy war, as he called it, on all those people who'd rejected him as God's prophet. They would start terrorizing the Meccan caravans for a start as they passed through the area. He promised his followers that if they followed him on this Jihad, they would be able to loot these caravans, keep a portion of the bounty they found, and therefore become exceedingly rich. And furthermore, as they conquered the surrounding towns and villages, they would be able to rape the women as well. As he had a habit of doing, he called down expedient revelations from Allah to support these plans. Sahih Muslim says the Apostle of Allah sent a military expedition to Autas on the occasion of the Battle of Hunain. They met their enemy and fought with them. They defeated them and took them captives. Some of the companions of the Apostle of Allah were reluctant to have intercourse with the female captives in the presence of their husbands, who were unbelievers. So Allah the Exalted sent down the Quranic verse, and all married women are forbidden unto you, except those captives whom your right hands possess. So conveniently for Muhammad and his followers, Allah suddenly permitted the rape of captive women in the presence of their husbands in that exact moment. Muhammad told followers that if they died in jihad for Islam, they would be guaranteed a life of ease in heaven, so it was a no-lose situation. They would be able to copulate with virgin women day and night. Muhammad said the humblest of the people of paradise shall have 80,000 servants and 72 wives. For the remaining 9 years of his life, Muhammad and his growing band of terrorists waged 95 wars on the surrounding region. That's an average of over 10 wars per year. He was constantly at war. And during those remaining years, he specifically ordered terrorism, beheadings, crucifixions, amputations, torture, child enslavement, rape, and much more. He became sadistic. On one occasion, the Hadith reports of some unfortunate souls. They were caught and brought to Muhammad. He commanded about them, and thus their hands and feet were cut off and their eyes were gouged, and then they were thrown into the sun until they died. Indeed, his capacity for this sadistic torture began to know no bounds. He caught a Jewish tribe called the Banu Qurayza, and Ibn Ishaq says, then the apostle went out to the market of Medina, which is still its market today, and dug trenches in it. Then he sent for the Banu Qurayza tribe and struck off their heads in those trenches as they were brought out to him in batches. There were 600 or 700 in all, though some put the figure as high as 800 or 900. So in genocidal fury against the Jews, Muhammad beheaded anywhere up to 900 people in a single day. Muhammad gorged himself on the lusts of his flesh as well. Around this time, when he was 53 years old, he married a 6-year-old girl called Aisha. Bukhari says the Prophet married her when she was 6 years old, and he consummated his marriage when she was 9 years old. The Hadith explicitly reports how he would fondle her in the bath. Aisha said, "The Prophet and I used to take a bath from a single pot and used to fondle me." He encouraged his followers to do the same thing with children. When one of his followers married a woman of similar age to himself, he said, "Why didn't you marry a young girl so that you could sport with her and she sport with you, or you could amuse with her and she could amuse with you?" Of course, Muhammad continued to call down convenient revelations from Allah to permit him to basically do whatever he wanted. Aisha actually called him out on his habit of doing this, wryly telling him, "I feel that your Lord hastens in fulfilling your desires and wishes." Muhammad actually had 11 wives at the same time during this period. Bukhari says the Prophet used to visit all his wives and around during the day and night, and they were 11 in number. It also says his clothes became so constantly soiled with semen that he would regularly go to mosque covered in it. Muhammad owned over 40 slaves in his lifetime as well. Muhammad had many male and female slaves. He used to buy and sell them, but he purchased more slaves than he sold. He once sold one black slave for 2. His purchase of slaves were more than he sold. Muhammad had a number of black slaves. One of them was named Maran. Muhammad forced him to do more labor than the average man. Whenever Muhammad went on a trip and he or his people got tired of carrying their stuff, he made Maran carry it. Maran said, "Even if I were carrying the load of 6 or 7 donkeys while we were on a journey, anyone who felt weak would throw his clothes or his shield or sword on me, so I would carry that heavy load." Basically, Muhammad's stated goal in the Medina years was nothing less than to conquer, to kill, and to enslave, especially those groups, as I said before, that had rejected him as a prophet, the Meccans, the Jews, and Christians, but then eventually the whole world. The stated aim of Islam is to conquer the whole world. And as they conquer people, they're to offer them just 3 options. They can either convert to Islam, be subjugated, and agree to live as second-class citizens, or die. Muhammad said, "Fight those who believe not in Allah nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which hath been forbidden by Allah and his messenger, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, even if they are people of the book, that is Jews and Christians, until they pay the jizya," that's a punitive tax, "with willing submission and feel themselves subdued." There are in fact 109 violent verses in the Quran like these that exhort the Muslims to fight unbelievers in jihad in this way. In fact, the Quran has a kind of split personality. It has some peaceful verses from the Meccan years when Muhammad was still trying to be taken seriously as a prophet in the lineage of Moses and Jesus. But then the Quran has all these violent verses from the Medina years when he'd given up on peace and he was just waging violent jihad. And this is what we should know about Islam. Islam works on a principle of abrogation, which means that all of those early peaceful verses from Mecca have actually been rendered null and void by these later violent Medina verses when he turned into a warlord, meaning that Islam is now just essentially about conquering and killing and enslaving. For example, "And fight them until there is no more fitna, that is unbelief in Allah, and the religion will be for Allah alone. The last day will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, 'O Muslim, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him.' But when the forbidden months are past, then fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them, and seize them, beleaguer them, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem of war." Every stratagem of war, by the way, includes deception. According to Islamic teaching, through a practice called taqiyya, Muslims are allowed to lie, deceive, and do anything sinful basically, as long as it furthers the cause of Islam. Therefore, Muslims are allowed to practice deceit, to lie, to make treaties they don't intend to keep, to catch their enemies off guard, and basically do anything they want if it furthers the cause of Islam. And that means that Muslims are inherently untrustworthy when they're trying to further their cause. And this is how Islam has basically spread throughout the world, not through the strength of Muhammad's teaching, which has always been rejected and been considered weak, but rather through deception, through threats, and violence. Indeed, if anyone should try to leave Islam, Muhammad said to kill them. The Prophet said, if somebody that is a Muslim discards his religion, kill him. That's the origin of so-called honor killings. That's why so few people dare to question or leave Islam. Islam perpetuates itself and sustains itself through nothing more than intimidation, fear, violence, and deceit. It's their modus operandi. And that's because, in summary, as we have seen, Muhammad himself was not really a prophet from God. He was an illiterate, depressive, demonically possessed, suicidal, paedophile warlord who commanded slavery, torture, crucifixions, beheadings, child enslavement, amputations, rape, deception, and murder. That is who Muhammad was. That is the nature of the religion he founded. And so ask yourself, is this really the kind of person that you want to follow? Okay, that's the end of the presentation on Islam. I hope you found it informative. And having now understood who Muhammad was, perhaps we now understand why we've had such a problem with Islamic terrorism in the West in recent decades, in fact, in recent centuries. As Muslims torture and kill and behead while shouting Allahu Akbar, they're just following their religion. This is Islam. This is what it is. This is what Muhammad himself did, and this is what he called for Muslims to do. The more a Muslim takes their faith seriously, the more they will be drawn to this kind of behavior: terrorism, violence, barbarism, subjugation. And therefore, perhaps we can now see how incredibly naive it's been of our leaders in the West to welcome Islam in the way that they have. Muslims are already trying to flex their muscles, even though they're still a minority. They're still trying to flex their muscles even now to remake the West in their image. But as soon as Muslims gain enough power, they will use force to try to subjugate and oppress non-Muslims. It's incredibly naive of these students to worship Allah, who commanded rape and enslavement and whose founder was a paedophile warlord. Islam should not be held in the same esteem as Christianity, because whereas in the previous video, we saw all the good that Christianity's brought to the world, Islam is the opposite. Islam's brought nothing but violence and barbarism. The faiths are just not comparable. There's good ideas and there's bad ideas, and Islam is a very, very bad idea. And if we don't start seeing it for what it is and change course very quickly, there are some very difficult days ahead. We need to wake up to what Islam actually is.